Evening, class. This is Enoch's son, your esteemed professor, back with another topical and poignant lecture. Now, class, when one mentions the words black leader, we often think of one of two people. We usually think of Malcolm X or Martin Luther King Jr. Two black men, two black leaders, two black men with seemingly opposing viewpoints on the way black people should attain their freedom, attain their civil rights. But were Malcolm X's and Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophies really that different? And that is why I will entitle this lecture, "The Revolution Will Be Analyzed." Now, class, your Professor Enoch's son came of age in the 90s. I graduated high school in 92. And to give you a sense of the times in the 90s, during the 90s, we had pretty much a black power movement resurgence. You know, the original Black Power movement was in the 60s and 70s, but in the 90s, for a couple of years, many of us black people in America were feeling the Black Power surge through our veins again. During the 90s, we had groups like Public Enemy, X-Clan, Brand Nubian, Jungle Brothers, who were saying something, who were so-called Afrocentric, who were talking about issues that affected the black community. Even during this time, rock groups were talking about something. Like people such as Kurt Cobain, Smashing Pumpkins, Nirvana, James Addiction, they were all talking about the inner angst, the frustration with living in American society. I'm saying this because I want to contrast this with the current American society, which seems to be devoid of any musicians really saying anything. But during the 90s, these pro-black groups, these so-called groups that said something, were making hits and had videos on mainstream rotation during, on MTV. That is very rare nowadays. Now, class, during this time too, Malcolm X had a resurgence. No one really mentioned Malcolm X in the 80s that much, to my knowledge. I never remember hearing people talk about Malcolm X until the 90s, until Spike Lee came out with Do the Right Thing, until Public Enemy came out with Fight the Power. I didn't really hear nobody talking about Malcolm X. And during this time, we didn't wear gold chains and rings that much. Some of us did, but what was in vogue was black medallions and Malcolm X t-shirts, black pendants, the red, black, and green. Now, class, during this time, we often bashed and looked down upon Martin Luther King. We saw Martin Luther King's way of nonviolent revolution as being soft. We saw Malcolm X as being more relevant to the modern day black man, the by any means necessary mantra that Malcolm X represented. We thought that represented us in the 90s. And I must admit, yours truly was really taken in by Malcolm X. I often thought that Malcolm X was more of an appealing character. He appealed more to my macho, male, testosterone-filled side more than Martin Luther King did. So I was pretty big on Malcolm X. But as I get older, I realize that maybe the whole by any means necessary approach to revolution is wrong. Because you see, you got to take in consideration of where we are. We're in America. America is not one of these third world countries that can be taken over by a small guerrilla unit. So it isn't very likely that a small bunch of black people armed to the teeth with AK-47s can really take over America or really change America, because America has the most advanced military in the world, the most advanced weapons in the world. Do you think that a black revolution could happen violently and be successful against America? So I often think that in hindsight, maybe Martin Luther King was more on point with his tactics of revolution. Because if you realize this too, class, that every violent revolution in America was shut down. I mean, you have the Black Panthers who considered themselves the sons of Malcolm. They considered themselves to, after Malcolm X died, they considered themselves to be I guess, the torch bearers of Malcolm's legacy. They were the ones that were going to take up where Malcolm X left off. And today, they're pretty much obsolete. They're pretty much, all Black Panthers, pretty much, I mean, including Eldridge Cleaver, Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, Fred Hampton, are either dead, in jail, or in exile. Now, you also have white groups who tried to oppose America, such as the Weathermen, who were these white kids, these white college kids who thought they were gonna fight with the Black Panthers. They saw America as evil for being oppressive to people of color, and they wanted to help the black man overthrow the white government during the 60s and 70s. And today, they're pretty much either done jail time, dead, or they're reformed and now are teaching somewhere. You have Operation Move, which were pretty much desecrated. They pretty much were blown up in Philadelphia. They had a 1985 standoff with the police in Philadelphia, and American police pretty much blew them to smithereens, and they're pretty much no longer even talked about or even remembered. You had David Koresh and the Branch Davidians who had a standoff with the ATF in Waco, and they're pretty much non-existent. Now, I say this to say this, class. I mean, I mentioned that to say this, class, that you see, violence never really solves anything. It is always better to get something that somebody wants to give you than to take it by force. It is better to have somebody give you, say, $10 than for you to put a gun in someone's face and take $10. So you see, Malcolm X's original plan of, by any means necessary, by putting a gun in a white man's face, not literally but figuratively, and taking their civil rights away from the American government, is the wrong way, in my opinion, because that violence births hostility. It births aggression. Violence is a cycle. When you perform violence on one person, oftentimes you are engulfed by a bigger wave of violence that will come back to haunt you in later years or later minutes. Also, class, in closing, I'd like to mention that many people seem to only, I guess, read half of the autobiography of Malcolm X. Because, yeah, in the beginning, he was a little violent. He wasn't really, to me, he was a guy who had that no bullshit approach to revolution. He wasn't going to be marching. He was going to say what he wanted to say, and someone tried to do something to him, he was gonna fight back. He wasn't going to turn the other cheek. But in the end of his life, right before he got killed, he had an epiphany after he found out that Elijah Muhammad, his mosque leader, who he pretty much viewed as a god, was sleeping around with a whole bunch of females. He kind of lost faith in the Nation of Islam, and he went on pilgrimage to Mecca. And when he went to Mecca, he saw white people and black people, Indian people, all worshiping the same God at Mecca. And that changed Malcolm X's viewpoint. And when he came back to America, he opened his own mosque. I think it was called Muslim Incorporated, something like that. I forgot the exact name. But he had his own organization, and they were moving into a more of a peaceful direction, more towards the center with Martin Luther King. So that is why I say that in the end, even Malcolm X saw the error of his ways and came to a more nonviolent way to fight against white supremacy. And with that being said, class, I would like to say, as above, so below.